Thank you for joining us for tonight's online talk. My name is Junko Takekawa, Senior Arts Program Officer at the Japan Foundation, London. We Japanese are expected to be familiar with kaiju monsters. In the process of growing up, we are exposed to many kaiju across various forms of media. However, I must shamelessly admit that, although I've heard of Godzilla, of course, I've never seen any Godzilla films until the day before yesterday, when I was one of the fortunate audience members enjoying Mothra versus Godzilla on the big screen at the Barbican cinema. I at least knew that kaiju are always the buddies, and there is always a hero who defeats them in the end. But the Godzilla series appears to be different from the simple formula of monsters equal evil, with many complicated messages like those about nuclear testing hidden within. For this special online talk, we are delighted to invite 3 experts to explore the significance of Godzilla and its franchise, commemorating the 70th anniversary of the first Godzilla film's release, and in conjunction with the Barbican's All Kaiju Attack film season, which also features Godzilla prominently. These experts are Alex Davidson, Barbican cinema curator who is behind the All Kaiju Attack film season and who will kindly act as a moderator for this season. Stephen Sloss, a film writer who specializes in Japanese tokusatsu or special effects films and who is a big fan of kaiju and the kaiju films, of course. And then Dr. Jeffrey Angles, Associate Professor of Japanese Literature and Translation Studies at Western Michigan University. He is also a poet and translator who translated the landmark novellas by Shigeru Kayama, Godzilla and Godzilla Rise Again, a project which was supported by Japan Foundation grant scheme. Thanks to the experts of these 3, I hope you'll be able to learn more about Godzilla in a cinematic as well as literary context. Next, housekeeping matters. Today's event will be recorded. As we are using the webinar function, your names will not be viewable by other attendees. However, I strongly recommend you keep your audio and video muted throughout, just in case. If you have any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A function to send them in at any time. Remember that your question can be seen by everyone else, so you can upvote another person's question if you'd like to hear its answers, or if it is the same as yours. Simply click the thumb up icon next to the question you wish to upvote. Unfortunately, due to time restrictions, we may not be able to pick up all the questions you asked, so my apologies in advance. Lastly, as always, we will send you an online questionnaire after the event, so please spare a short moment to complete it and help improve our future events. That's all from me, so now I'd like to hand over to Alex and the other panelists to start this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Junko, and I hope Jeffrey is joining us too. I can see Stephen is successful. Oh, here he is, great. So thank you everyone online for joining us on what in London at least is a very sunny evening. And as Junko says, we'll start off with probably about 45 minutes of discussion between myself, Jeffrey and Stephen, and then we'll open up to audience questions. So do leave any questions you have in the Q&A box. And if I don't think I'm ignoring them, because I will come to them for the last 35, 40 minutes of the event, but you can leave the questions any time. So Junko very kindly has done the introduction, so I'm going to dive straight in. And before we go into the books, the scenarios, the novelisations of the first 2 Godzilla films, the figure of Shigeru Kayama, and the challenges in translation, I think I'm going to start with what might sound like a deceptively simple question, but one I think is quite important, which is how we first engage with kaiju cinema, because I think different people in different areas of the world have very different experiences of how they first access a Godzilla film. So I'm going to throw that, and so we have people. We have Jeffrey joining us from from the USA, and Stephen from the UK. So I'll start with Jeffrey. What was your first encounter with Godzilla, and what was what was special about it for you? Why did you focus on kaiju films?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Alex. When I was a little boy in the 1970s, there were a lot of Godzilla movies on television, often on Saturday afternoons when kids were likely to be home and watching television. So I first caught some of the Godzilla films, probably not the original Godzilla film from 1954, but some of the later, more kind of popular, lighter, funner movies that were dedicated or made with children in mind. I saw those on television on Saturday, and like many other kids of my generation, I enjoyed stomping on shoe boxes, pretending like it was Tokyo. So my first exposure to Godzilla films was as a kid through fandom. It was only later that I kind of came to appreciate kaiju film for their important messaging and for their kind of historical value.
Thank you. And Stephen, same question. What was your first encounter with Godzilla?
I can remember the exact year. It was 2000. And my family and I were on a holiday in the English seaside town of Skegness. And there was an old video shop there, and I can't remember what it was called or exactly where it was, and I'm sure it's long gone now. But in that shop, there was a video of Godzilla versus King Ghidorah, directed by Kazuki Omori from 1991. And my dad, who I get a lot of my film appreciation from, and we still share a love of it together to this day, just knew something that I guess I didn't and bought it for me. I guess just knowing that I'd be doing a talk on Godzilla online 24 years later. But that's where it started. We watched it when we came home from the holiday, and I'd never seen anything like it before. I'd never seen special effects like it before. And that was it. Unlike Jeffrey's experience, and I'm sure if there's a lot of UK attendees listening right now, there's not a lot of Godzilla or other kaiju films or even other monster movies on UK television. As in my lifetime, I can remember literally a handful. Maybe I can count on one hand how many there's been. So not a lot of TV viewing, a lot of VHS collecting, which turned into DVD collecting, which turns into Blu-ray, etc., etc. And my parents were very, very supportive of what they probably thought was a childhood phase and interest. And like I said, here we are 24 years later.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, my first encounter was as a teenager when I think Channel 4 showed some very badly dubbed versions of the Showa era Godzilla films, not the color ones, let's say. And yeah, I was kind of hooked despite the trappings of a dubbed film. So I'm gonna move on to the creation of Godzilla, the scenario stage. But before I do, and this is a question again, I'll throw to both of you, and I'll start with Stephen. Is I think it's important to give a bit of context about what the world of post-war Japan was like and why it is significant that Godzilla came to be in the early 1950s. It's quite a lot. There's a lot of context, and we can't go into all of it now. But Stephen, would you mind kicking off?
Yeah, like you said, it's a very broad subject, and it's I'll try and encapsulate it with sensitivity. So as I'm sure everyone here knows, at the end of the Second World War, when Japan surrendered, it entered a state of a United States occupation, where there was a significant American government presence in Japan. There was a lot of purging of culture, norms. For example, a great deal of pre-war Japanese cinema is completely lost, including some early, what we could argue to be kaiju films. And what all of kaiju cinema ultimately comes back to at its roots to this day, with Godzilla Minus One and Shin Godzilla, is the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A great, great, great impact on the Japanese national psyche that informs the kaiju genre as a whole and sets it apart from other monster films, US, UK, whatever monster films. And it is very important for us to remember that, you know, Japan is the only nation on earth to have suffered at the hands of nuclear weapons. So if we fast forward from the end of World War II to March 1954, the year that the original Godzilla was released, but later in the year, in March 1954, the fishing vessel Lucky Dragon number 5, a small crew, a small Japanese fishing crew, very tragically sailed too close to the blast zone of Castle Bravo US nuclear tests. And without them even knowing it, they were irradiated. And in the subsequent months after returning to the Japanese mainland, all of the crew members very sadly passed away. And they are, to this day, the last remaining victims of a nuclear bomb. So this incident, along with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, greatly inform the original Godzilla. Indeed, a version of the a fictionalized version of the Lucky Dragon incident is what opens Ishiro Honda's original film. And from there, real life informs the monster fable of Godzilla. And while, you know, we can nitpick about what defines a kaiju film, etc., etc., to me, the kaiju film is born in this instant with the original Godzilla. Certainly, it's had its own influences, and there's been Japanese films featuring monsters and creatures of various descriptions and sizes that predate Godzilla. But the kaiju genre, as we know it today, begins with Ishiro Honda's Godzilla.
Thank you, Stephen. And I think we'll probably go into a bit more detail about the Lucky Dragon incident because it's quite key in the
Indeed.
creation of the scenario. So Jeffrey, we're going to move on now to the figure of Shigeru KAYAMA and his involvement with the creation of Godzilla. So before we get to the Godzilla stage, who was KAYAMA and what was his... could you tell us a bit about who he was before Godzilla made his name, let's say?
Yes, so KAYAMA is a name that probably is not very familiar to American audiences or to British audiences. To the best of my knowledge, there's never been any work of his translated before this. Although he was a very important popular science fiction writer in the mid-20th century, he started his career in the late 1940s. During the time when, after the wartime, the Japanese population was just starving for good, entertaining literature to read. He had worked at the Ministry of Finance during Japan's involvement during World War II. But he submitted some stories to a popular boys' adventure / mystery magazine and won a prize with his debut work. And so as a result of that, he quickly came into prominence and he started publishing really, really widely. About the time that Godzilla was made, he was producing as many as 40 different stories, essays, and pieces of writing per year in various different magazines. So he was really kind of at his height. Steve gave a really introduction to the story of Godzilla, but so in March of 1954 there was the Castle Bravo bombing, which unfortunately involved the Lucky Dragon number 5 fisherman. And so by May of 1954, when the idea for the movie came about, already the bombing of the Lucky Dragon number 5 was front page news. The Japanese government investigated and discovered that that from all over the Pacific, there was radioactive tuna being brought to the Japanese market. And so it became very clear to the Japanese population that almost regardless of like what they did, radiation that was created by forces outside of Japan was going to come back home and visit the Japanese whether they liked it or not. Kayama was one of many people who was very disturbed by this fact. And so when the producer at Toho Studios, a fellow by the name of Tanaka Tomoyuki, came to Kayama and said, "Hey, you're this popular writer who's at the height of his game. Will you sit down and will you write a story about a radioactive monster for us?" Kayama said, "Absolutely, I'd be happy to do it." And he wrote Godzilla originally as his own sort of form of anti-nuclear protest. He really conceived of Godzilla very much as a anti-nuclear project. And so that as the cost of the movie got larger and larger and larger, they were working within a very tight time frame. The story got underway in May of 1954, and it was slated to come out in theaters in November of 1954. So in order to kind of the monster, in order to create all the cities that he destroys and everything like that, Toho Studios hired this vast crew of people to kind of turn Kayama's story into the film that we know today.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And Stephen, Jeffrey sort of outlined the prevalent nuclear anxiety at the time, but there was also perhaps an influence from contemporary Hollywood films that might have inspired in some way the Godzilla film.
Yeah.
What do you think? What films might have led to this?
Well, we can see the two big influences on screen here at the moment. The influence of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms by Eugene Leroy is inarguable. To me, there's been some discussion in recent years of certain fans, certain scholars are sort of keen to just separate the influence of this film on Godzilla. But to my mind, it's unavoidable, and that's okay. When Tomoyuki Tanaka was conceiving of Godzilla, his original title for the film translated to something like the great monster from 20,000 miles beneath the sea, and that's beyond argument. Didn't even change it to 30,000 or something. So even an ancient prehistoric reptilian monster being awakened by the nuclear issue, it itself being radioactive and rampaging through a major metropolis it makes seem like a fairly broad plot idea these days, but back then that's very specific, and it's inarguable the influence of the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. The other big one is obviously the original King Kong, which the legendary special effects director of the original Godzilla and many more Toho, Kaiju, and Tokusatsu special effects films, Eiji Tsuburaya, was very vocal about this being his favorite film. It gave him much of his love of filmmaking. There's yarns about him helping shelter children during the war and entertaining them with stories of King Kong. And it's notable particularly as a special effects technician, Tsuburaya. He wanted to bring Godzilla to life with stop motion animation, like in King Kong, like in The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, but neither time, as Jeffrey touched upon, neither time nor budget, or indeed expertise allowed for that. There was no real stop motion experts in Japan at the time, so this is where suitmation, as it is popularly called these days, was pioneered, and Godzilla was brought to life famously by a stunt performer by the name of Haruo Nakajima, physically portraying the monster in a suit.
Thank you. So, Jeffrey, back to Kayama. So I suppose he's often described as creating the scenario for Godzilla. And before we go into that in a bit more detail, that word scenario means different things to different people. What broadly does it mean in this context?
So Kayama sheltered himself away from the world after being asked for this thing, and in the scenario that he produced is something that's kind of half story and half like script. So we do have thank goodness we do have the original version of the script that he submitted to Toho Studios. It's available in Japan in this particular volume, which you can easily get at any bookstore. It's kind of written with some story, like plot kind of laid out, but then there's segments where it kind of switches into like the format that you would see in reading a play, say, where you know, so and so says this, so and so says that, and then there's some sort of stage directions. So Kayama produced this scenario within the space. I've read different accounts. Some people say within a week. Some people say within 10 days. So you know, he wrote it very, very, very quickly. However, the scenario that he produced contains the general trajectory of the film that we now know for 1954. There were of course lots and lots of changes and lots of small additions made. For instance, certain characters were promoted, you know, in the kind of rewriting and the working of the scenario. You know, given a larger role. Some characters, their roles were reduced somewhat. And of course, Kayama didn't put as much description about like some of the special effects scenes as one might assume, and that's because, of course, you know, the people like Tsubaraya, who Stephen mentioned just a moment ago, was going to take, you know, the monster scenes and do whatever he was going to do with them, and so you know, Kayama specifically let some space in there for the special effects folks to do their work. But anyway, after the film was completed, and it was a massive, huge success for reasons that I hope we can talk about, Kayama did sit down and decided to write the novelisations of these films, and those were the texts that I translated. These are actually kind of, Kayama went back to his scenario, took his scenario, sort of reworked it, and then included some scenes that were developed for the film and kind of put it all together in one book form. He wrote it for young adults because, you know, he really wanted his anti-nuclear messaging, you know, to be sent to a new, younger generation. When he wanted the younger generation to carry on that message.
And am I right that the Lucky Dragon incident also informed the scenario in a bit more detail than the finished film?
It does, that's correct. So at the very beginning of the scenario that he submitted to Toho Studios in 1954, he begins by saying that he wanted to include like a whole bunch of series that were of shots that were taken from historical footage. Like he wanted to show actual shots of nuclear bombs going off. He wanted to show Lucky Dragon #5 pulling into port. He wanted to show people protesting the radioactive tuna that they learned in 1954 was coming to Japanese markets. But because this movie was, you know, produced under such a tight time frame, and the budget very quickly began to spiral out of control, the director, Honda, we haven't mentioned very much yet, Honda began to feel like he was skating on thin ice. This is the first radioactive monster movie, the first kaiju movie ever to be made in Japan, in a big way. And so he, you know, as the special effects budget began to grow and grow and grow, and, you know, they were producing these, like, you know, super detailed, intricate, you know, sets of Tokyo and so on with large numbers of people, it just became very expensive very quickly. And so Honda began to worry that maybe he was skating on thin ice by you know, making this big budget movie. He didn't know if it was going to be a success. So he wanted to try to eliminate all barriers to success. And so one of the things that he decided to do was he decided to kind of like take the movie out of the realm of protest film and kind of, you know, plant it more squarely within the world of fiction. So like the director decided against Kayama's suggestion to put in like historical footage. He's like, no, let's just, you know, carry this only over into the world of fiction. But even despite the fact that he does that, Stephen was right in saying that, like, you know, the anti-nuclear messaging comes through loud and clear, nonetheless, in the final film. So I think that ultimately that was a relatively wise decision on Honda's part. I think fewer people are likely to watch protest films than are likely to watch, you know, big monster movies nowadays. So.
Mm. And you touched upon this already, but the film obviously was a huge success. Why do you think it hit? Why do you think it captured the public imagination so acutely?
Yeah, so there were a number of scenes in the film that were specifically designed to kind of evoke Japanese war memories of World War II. There's a number of scenes where, for instance, the characters, after Godzilla has come into the city and left, he leaves a trail of radiation behind him. And so, like, for instance, there's one scene in which a young child is in a hospital and the doctors are running a Geiger counter over here, and we see the characters kind of shake their head, realizing that this young child has been irradiated by radiation. Like scenes like that were specifically designed to evoke memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so there was that kind of a way in which the film appealed to adults, the kind of messaging. There were also scenes of Tokyo on fire, which reminded many people of their unresolved lingering traumas of surviving World War II. It's perhaps not as well known as the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, but there was one night in March of 1945 which left more people dead from traditional firebombing than from the Hiroshima or Nagasaki blasts. This bombing raid in March of 1945 left also 1 million people homeless. And so, there were scenes that were like specifically in the film to kind of evoke these memories, and a lot of people who went to the theater as adults to watch this film broke into tears while watching it. The film provided a method for people to kind of get in touch with and re-feel some of the old traumas that were still with them from World War II. So it appealed to adults in that way. And then also to children. Children love the scenes where Godzilla was rampaging through the cities. So the film had a kind of multivalent appeal to people at the time. It appealed to adults in one way and appealed to children in a very different way. So it reached two different audiences.
And this wouldn't be the last Godzilla scenario that Kayama worked on. So after the huge success of the first Godzilla film, he was commissioned, let's say, to do a scenario for a sequel. What challenges did he face when coming up with a second film?
So because the Godzilla 1954 was such a success, almost immediately, right out of the gate, the people at Toho Studios turned to him and said, "Hey, let's make a sequel." And Kayama wasn't necessarily very keen on this idea at first. He reluctantly agreed, but his main concern was, guys, don't you remember at the end of Godzilla 1954, the first movie, we killed Godzilla. He's dead at the end of the movie. So where are we going to get Godzilla #2? At the very end of Godzilla 1954, I hope I'm not spoiling it for anyone who hasn't seen it here in the audience, but there's a moment in which after Godzilla is killed, one of the main characters, the paleontologist Yamane, says, if we keep up our irresponsible use of hydrogen weapons, who's to say that another Godzilla might emerge again? So this was kind of a loophole that was written into the first movie that Kayama decided to exploit for the second movie. So he brought back a Godzilla, not the Godzilla, but another one of his species for the second film. And so the second film, Godzilla Raids Again, which came out in an unbelievably, almost impossibly short time frame in April 1955, just 5 months, after Toho Studios asked them to come up with this idea. It's a simpler film, somewhat, I'd say. It's less complex in terms of its messaging, and it features like big monster fights. One Godzilla fighting Anguirus, another big kaiju in the city of Osaka this time. So it places its focus in a different place. Kayama was happy to go along with the second movie, but he did say, my original purpose of using Godzilla as a metaphor for radiation is being somewhat subverted by the fact that we're bringing him back. Even he admitted that he began to love Godzilla, who he had originally conceived of as a big, frightening, monstrous thing. So he did say, like, after in October 1955, Godzilla Raids Again will be the last for me. No matter how much the movie companies might request it, I firmly decided I'm not going to write another sequel, no matter what. It is interesting. I just came across an essay by Kayama just a few days ago, in which he said that despite the fact that he kind of cut his ties with the Godzilla franchise after the second movie, he did continue to receive the invitations by Toho Studios every time they released a new Godzilla movie, and so it became like a ritual within his life, to go and see the new Godzilla movie and to enjoy it. But I do think that he felt like the Godzillas that were coming out in later iterations of the franchise were somewhat different in terms of their tone and effect than the one he had originally conceived of for 1954.
Yeah,
Sorry,
literally
that was a bit of a long answer.
No, I was going to make a bad pun about literally creating a monster, but I'll move on quickly. So, I mean, just before we move on to the novelizations, and this is a question for both of you, is I should ask actually what you think of the first Godzilla film, but I'm going to guess you're both admirers. But Godzilla Rages Again, I remember this, is the Godzilla was restored, I can't remember when it was, about 15 years ago, and had a release in the UK, at least, by the British Film Institute. And suddenly people started taking, in the UK at least, this film with a lot more seriousness and a lot more respect. Godzilla Raids Again, I think, is rather a more polarizing work. And I just wanted to ask you both, and I'll start with Stephen, what's your take on Godzilla Raids Again?
The thing about Godzilla Raids Again is that I think in a way it's misunderstood, because in no way is it trying to be the same film as the original. It can't be. You can't replicate that, but also it's not trying to. It's quite different tonally. The characters are of a different breed. Even the monster action is very, very different, the way it's shot and staged, than the original film. Importantly, Ishiro Honda did not return to direct this film. He was busy doing Half Human at the time. So this was directed by a still to this day relatively unknown director called Motoyoshi Oda, who by all accounts was very capable, very reliable, assignee director. He was just assigned to projects and he would get them out reliably, on time, etc. So this was very much a quickie sequel with the intent of capitalization, but that doesn't have to be a bad thing. Like, look, this film has several parallels with another very quick monster movie sequel, Son of Kong, which came out the same year as the original King Kong, both with minimal original cast returns, both featuring a successor to the original monster, as it were, and both being I suppose you could say lesser films, but very different films. Godzilla Raids Again is much more of a personal film. It focuses on a very small group of mostly civilian characters, or formerly military characters, but now civilian characters, who find themselves embroiled in the reemergence of Godzilla and the appearance of Anguirus. And the as civilians, they wrestle with their own sense of responsibility, whether they can help, what they can do, etc., etc., and how their personal lives are impacted by this, rather than how the country as a whole is impacted by disaster. It also has a lot of it's much more of a war film, I would say, more than the original. There's a lot, and like the original, there are a lot of echoes of the war. As Jeffrey touched on, these films were cathartic to adult Japanese audiences at the time, and it gave them a chance to process or reprocess their wartime trauma. And this film features a lot of wartime imagery as well. Even the two protagonists are former fighter pilots who find themselves being, well, they don't find themselves being re-enlisted. They voluntarily re-enlist to help in the anti-Godzilla plan. They leave their fiancés behind. You've got the idea of the men going off to war and the women being left behind. There's a fantastic image in this film. One of the characters looks at the city of Osaka from a distance of safety, as a great huge plume of smoke is engulfing the entire city. The film has a lot of merit, and I think that is ignored, and has been ignored for almost 70 years to a degree, just by way of it not measuring up to a film that is impossible to measure up to, quite frankly. Also worth noting quickly that the soundtrack to this film was by Masaru Sato, who would go on to compose more Godzilla soundtracks, but was also is primarily known in the West as Akira Kurosawa's primary composer. So there is not insignificant talent behind this film. It's just a very different, smaller, quieter film, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Jeffrey, what's your take?
Yeah, no, I 100% back up everything that Stephen just said. I think that it was a really good summation. One of the reasons I think that Godzilla rates again to just given such attention until fairly recently was because it was only available until that massively cut up, bastardized version of it that was available I think in the English speaking world for the longest time. Like the first Godzilla film, the second Godzilla film was imported to the U.S. It was cut up by RKO, and new scenes were interspersed in this kind of modified, localized, domesticized version was the one that was available in the English-speaking world for a very long time. And I think it's far inferior to the actual original Japanese version. So that was one reason I think that it didn't achieve as much. But I like Stephen, I think that it's a much undervalued film. It has good acting. It has very amazing special effects for the time. And I think one of the things, when people often talk about how the first movie from '54 had important messages, but the second one didn't, I'm not sure I completely agree with that, because I feel like in the second film, Japan really beautifully captures the sense of being a kind of somewhat neutral nation caught between two gigantic superpowers. Much as Japan felt like it was caught between the US and the Soviet Union in its nuclear arsenal during the post-war period. So I do feel like this film is in some kind of very interesting indirect ways reflecting the kind of hegemonic power of the superpowers in the mid 1950s onward, in the Cold War.
I mean, speaking as a fan rather than sort of deep expert in the early kaiju films, I think Godzilla Raids Again, I remember starting very strongly, and you have this, they actually reveal the monsters very early, which is a trait you sort of see in more modern kaiju films, but also setting up this one monster battles another scenario, which obviously which would dominate the series from then on. So I think it is an intriguing film. I think there are some pacing issues, but I think in general it's not a very long film. But I think as you both have said, there's quite a lot of merit in it. So on to the novelization. So KAYAMA last seen having written the two scenarios, having mixed feelings, let's say, about particularly the second film and the ongoing franchise, but is then writes two novelizations, one for each film. So Jeffrey, why did he do this?
So he doesn't ever actually explain anywhere in his oeuvre that I've been able to find, why he does it. But so I've had to read between the lines a bit in order to try to figure this out. But I think it's very interesting the fact that he releases these novelizations as the first volume in a series called the Youth Library, Shonen Bunko. So it was going to be a proposed series of kind of novels for young adults. He clearly decides that he's going to write this story for young adults. And in the course of doing that, one of the major changes that he makes from the movies to the novelizations is that he decides to refocus a lot of the action on adolescent heroes. So it's actually the adolescent heroes that are going through the angst of, what's going to befall Japan. What are the moral responsibilities of scientists? It's actually kind of the adolescent characters who grow up and are, experiencing a lot of their life in the post-World War II period that are able to give the kind of clearest answers to this. I think that KAYAMA himself felt that it was the future generation, the young people that are going to be able, hopefully, to lead Japan out of its nuclear quagmire. It's kind of difficult spot as of a vulnerable nation between two nuclear superpowers. And so I think that he felt like young readers are the ones that are going to be the ones who need to carry this message forward into the future. So that kind of refocusing of the attention on the young characters is by far the biggest change between the film and the novelizations. Steve, do you want to add to that?
There's also a significant. I read the novelizations, the translations, shortly after they were released. And
Thank you.
the big one that stuck out to me, the big difference in Godzilla is the presence of a subplot regarding a Godzilla worshipping cult, as it were, who are distributing propaganda leaflets, etc., throughout Tokyo. It's been about 6 months since I read it, so my memory is a little hazy, but they're saying things like, "Thank you, Godzilla, bring destruction down on us," basically saying something like, "We deserve this." And it creates a lot of unease, great upset. They start to they accuse Dr. Yamane, the Takashi Shimura character, of creating Godzilla himself, and that it's a robot wearing a sort of skin, which weirdly foreshadows Mechagodzilla 20 years later. But I digress. So that subplot is really, really interesting. And it amounts to nothing, doesn't it? It just turns out it's a small group basically messing with people.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, yeah. And it was very interesting, but I can also see why it was removed from any sort of screenplay draft because, well, like I said, it doesn't really amount to much, does it?
Correct, correct. You're right. It doesn't go anywhere. I do think though, probably Kayama was including this as a way to kind of comment that in any sort of disaster scenario, there are going to be bad actors that try to use
Yeah.
this disaster for their own nefarious purposes, whatever those might be.
Yeah, bad
Um,
faith argument. Yeah.
Right, right. This is just a very small aside, but if any listeners out there are familiar with the film Akira, one of the kind of main, classic iconic anime animated films. There's a subplot that's almost identical to this in Akira. I can't help but wonder if the creators of Akira, Otomo, wasn't thinking about this plot in Kayama's Godzilla, but I can't prove that. But
And so I imagine there were, but were there any challenges in the translation process of these novelizations?
yes, yeah, there were quite a few. So I've done a lot of translation of Japanese poetry and Japanese novels. I've kind of specialized in novels that people consider hard to read, and so I have to say that in some ways this book was really refreshing for me to translate because a lot of it's very concrete. Like the Godzilla when he's stomping on buildings in Tokyo, it's quite clear what he's doing. There's no ambiguity in the language. However, there are some kind of interesting questions about like the Japanese language that did arise in this novel that were a bit challenging. For instance, in Japanese, there is a gigantic number of onomatopoetic expressions, a large number of expressions that relate to sound words. Like in English, we've got a lot of words like, crack, crunch, and so on. But like, here's a passage that I just chose almost at random as Godzilla is crunching through Tokyo. It says, the next thing to catch his eyes was a tall television tower. Crack! He broke it off with a single paw. Then crunch, crunch! He bent it nearly double with his ferocious strength, leaving it a twisted mess. He let out a ferocious roar that echoed high across the sky. And so on. So in Japanese, actually, there's so many different sound-related words. Like actually, the one that I translated is crack, dawa. It's like actually kind of the sound of. It's really not so much a crack as like the sound of like Godzilla swatting something, grabbing it. But because he kind of breaks it off with the act of swatting at it and grabbing it, I decided to represent that as crack because I couldn't quite think of the right onomatopoeia to express the grabbing onto kind of sound, thwack or something like that. I don't know. And then gari gari is like, the sound of metal crumpling. That one, I guess crunch crunch works fairly well. But and then in the next paragraph, there's a place where you see that like Godzilla began to retreat towards Tsukiji. And in Japanese, there's an onomatopoetic expression. He retreats noshi noshi. And noshi noshi is like a sound of kind of somebody moving in a slow lumbering way. I couldn't think of like an onomatopoetic expression in English to represent that. I probably could. Now that I think about it, I probably could have said something like he lumbered back towards Skiji Bay or whatever. But anyway, because I couldn't think of an onomatopoeia for that particular sound, I decided to insert another onomatopoeia for it to represent his grrr, his roar there. In the Japanese, in that particular section, all it does is describe his roar rather than actually kind of, you know, like include the sound of it. So I had to like, and another, my point is that there are certain words for which Japanese has like ready to go onomatopoeias, and we sometimes have similar ones in English, and if so, I use them. But if we didn't have something that was similar, I tried to figure out something, another kind of onomatopoeia that I could put into the same place in the text to kind of, you know, to maintain the same level of oral qualities that was in the original. So like the original is very, very noisy. It's very crashing and banging and booming, and especially in the disaster scenes. So that was kind of a challenge to figure out ways to kind of get all of those into the English and not have it be too absolutely ridiculous. It's not something I think that we're used to seeing in a lot of English prose, unless it's in, you know, comic books or something. Another one of the problems that I had was with gender. If we could go to the next slide. So this same passage in Japanese, so on the left-hand side, it kind of shows what it looks like in Japanese. In Japanese, you never have to use gendered pronouns, ever. You don't have to. And nowhere in the entire book, anywhere, is there any hint whatsoever about the gender of Godzilla. So I started out by translating Godzilla as it, you know. In Japanese, it's very easy to have an entire book, you know, where you don't mention the person's gender. Like, for instance, you know, it kind of reads like this. The next thing to catch blank's eyes was a tall television tower. Crack. So-and-so broke it off with a single paw, then crunch, crunch, bent it nearly double with their ferocious strength. But you can see, like, just even as I'm reading it now, like, you know, in English, you kind of have to put something into those spaces, right? Like English forces us to identify who is doing the action, much more so than Japanese does. So I'm left with the problem: do I make Godzilla a him or her, a they, an it, or what? So I started off by making Godzilla an it in my first draft of the translation, but then the people that read it didn't like it at all. They're like, Godzilla has way too much personality to just be an it. So then I tried they, you know, as in the kind of new popular usage of it as sort of a non-gendered singular. But then that also can introduce a lot of confusion where Godzilla is interacting with different characters. So is the they Godzilla, or is the they the people that he's crushing? So in the end, at the advice of my editor, I decided to go with his, make Godzilla male, even though that's not necessarily present there in the original. So this is a really kind of interesting problem that arises, that I didn't actually think about at all. I always sort of just kind of assumed that Godzilla was male until I sat down and actually started working on this. But actually the situation is a little bit more complicated. Toho Studio's official policy is that Godzilla is an it, and Godzilla is not a he or a she or a they. But I think that that's not how we talk about Godzilla in popular parlance, at least in the US. I don't know about the UK, but.
No, I think I mean the genre, gender, not genre, of kaiju is something that I can get, like, when we were sort of getting speakers to come in and introduce the films at the Barbican. There's this thing of, oh, this giant monster has an egg, but does that mean the monster's female or not? So
right,
I'm trying not to be too fussy. I also want to add, after your demonstration of the onomatopoeia, I'm campaigning for an audiobook of these translations too, but we'll see how we go. Now,
there is an audiobook being made, I understand. So,
oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, cool. Are you involved in the voices, or not so much?
No, I'm not. So I've just heard a sample from the voice actor, but I'm thrilled. I'm so excited to hear how this is going to sound in the audio version.
Fantastic. And I'm just going to ask one more question, because I know we have a lot of audience questions and I really want to get through as many as I can. Is my final question for this section of the discussion is, so these books were published in the 1950s. Why has it taken so long? And I'll get Stephen's take on this and Jeffrey's, but it's of why has it taken so long for these translations to become manifest? We know the film's been popular all around the world. What are your sort of thoughts there? Stephen, do you have any thoughts on that matter?
Well, obviously, uh, Jeffrey will know much better than I do and will know the exact reasons, I'm sure. But if I had to speculate, I would say potentially lack of knowledge that they even existed as books, as texts. I think we think of Godzilla um solely as a cinematic character, which is not unfair. It's not unreasonable to think that way. But I would say probably lack of awareness that these actually existed, and probably lack of awareness of Kayama as a writer. I wouldn't say lack of interest or anything, as the book's success has proven in the last year or so. But yeah, I would say probably lack of awareness.
Yeah, no, I think that Stephen is exactly right about that. We do think of Godzilla, and first and foremost, as a cinematic phenomenon, and I think that that's undeniable. It was created as a film, from the very beginning, and it's a spectacular film. It's difficult to wash that cinematic experience out of our minds, if we after seeing it. But I'd also like to add to that that this was published in 1955, and so in 1950s and 1960s, 1970s, even through the 1980s, the overwhelming majority of people that were translating Japanese literature were academics. And so academics, I think, have often given short shrift to works of popular literature, especially works of literature that were written for young adults. And that's a hugely unfair and sad thing. Japan has a great tradition of young adult literature, so much great young adult literature that is sitting on the shelf begging for people to translate it. Things that have sold millions of copies are still unknown and unavailable in English yet. So this is I think that this particular book is just one example of how popular fiction deserves to have much bigger audiences, and have more translators working on it. Unfortunately, now I think we're living in a golden age of Japanese to English literary translation. There's being more done now than I think there has been at just about any point in the past by a variety of translators from a variety of different backgrounds, including academicians like myself, and also people who are just working in the field of popular manga translation as well. So we're getting a much broader view of some of the things that are actually out there.
Thank you. So thank you for all the questions that have been submitted into the Q&A inbox. Do keep them coming, but I'll read out, apologies in advance if I mispronounce anyone's name, but I'll start with a question from Jonathan Root, which I will direct to Jeffrey, though Stephen can also chip in, which is it safe to say that Godzilla began the trend of both kaiju films and tokusatsu films, or are there earlier precedents and influences?
Yeah, no, Godzilla is from 1954 is definitely the granddaddy of all of them. Yes, there were monsters and ghosts in some early Japanese film, but definitely this one kind of set the mold for future kaiju films. I think we can say that fairly safely. Would you agree, Stephen?
Yeah, absolutely. I personally have a fairly strict definition of what constitutes a kaiju film, and especially these days, it's not particularly widely agreed with. Like, for example, I broadly don't consider any non-Japanese films, particularly US films, as kaiju films. There are exceptions to that rule, obviously, but for example, something like The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms or the original King Kong, I would never consider a kaiju film. To me, that's like calling The Searchers a spaghetti western, But I digress. But so to me, yes, Ishiro Honda's Godzilla 1954 is the inception point of the genre as we know it today, both in terms of the kaiju genre and the medium of tokusatsu, which for anyone who isn't aware in this conference is a Japanese filmmaking style involving particular camera work and practical special effects, often models and miniatures, etc. But while I consider Godzilla the first kaiju tokusatsu film, it's not without its own predecessors in Japan. And the ones that come to mind are three lost films, three pre-war lost films, which are not strictly kaiju films, but they embody a lot of the things which we might, which might allow us to classify them at least in an honorary way. The first one is called Japanese King Kong, quite a literal title. It capitalized on the release of the original King Kong in Japan, and as far as I'm aware, it involves a stage performer, like a Japanese vaudeville performer, who finds himself trapped inside a King Kong costume. The second one is also a King Kong film called The King Kong That Appeared in Edo, and which features a monstrous ape in uh, feudal Japan. Um, it doesn't look a lot like King Kong. It looks more like a sort of Sasquatch type creature, but it was called The King Kong That Appears in Edo. And the third one is a film called The Giant Buddha Statues Travel Through the Country, which is quite literal. A giant Buddha statue comes to life and visits many scenic and iconic areas of Japan. Not strictly are the three of these are really kaiju films, but they have despite being lost and unavailable to view to this day, they are very important historical records in a way, and it's tragic that they're lost. Um, these films from the 30s even share some crew members who would go on to work on the original Godzilla. And the last one I want to mention is a 1924, I think, 1921, I apologize, silent film called Jiraiya the Brave, which is an adaptation of a Japanese folk tale, The Tale of the Gallant Jiraiya, which was later adapted in the 60s by Toei Studios as The Magic Serpent. But this film is important. It's a black and white silent film, about 20 minutes long, but it features special effects techniques which would go on to define kaiju and tokusatsu cinema with Godzilla in 1954, including optical photography, matte work, matte paintings, etc., and miniatures and performers in monster costumes. So while I do consider Godzilla to be the inception of the kaiju genre as we know it and define it today, it's not without its own predecessors in Japan.
Thank you.
That's,
If-
can I just add
yeah,
one
go
more
ahead.
to that? After the success of these Godzilla translations, I've been working on creating an anthology of kaiju literature, and this is still in the works right now. Publisher to be determined, but I think I've got someone on the line, hooked on the other end of that line. But I've had this really interesting question of how far do I go back when looking for Godzilla's predecessors? If we, the very earliest book ever written in Japan, the Kojiki, written in the 8th century, and there's one of the, it's about the mythology of the world, the coming of the gods to the earth, and the way that they established, humanity and everything else, and then eventually that leading to the age of the ancient Japanese emperors. That's what the book is about. But in there's like, for instance, a story about a gigantic snake that has 8 heads and that is terrorizing a village. And
Orochi.
yes, exactly. And so like right here at the very, very beginning of Japanese literature, the first book ever written in the Japanese language, there is something like an ancestor to the kaiju genre. So there are really interesting kind of predecessors to Godzilla out there. In the 20th century, there were stories in Japan like that were kind of inspired by Jules Verne, the French science fiction writer. There's one novel written in the 1920s by Hisao Jurang, a popular Japanese writer about people who go down into a pocket in the earth and they discover all these large creatures in very Jules Verne-like fashion. And so there are like big monsters throughout Japanese literature before and definitely after this. But the inception of Godzilla, I think, is changed the way that big monsters were depicted in Japan afterwards. So like 1954 is kind of like a turning point in the history of kaiju literature, not just kaiju film, but yeah, Godzilla begins to kind of leave its imprint on almost all the subsequent, big monsters that come afterward, 1954 onward.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was a bit of a
No,
digression.
it's really interesting because this is a big controversy about what is and isn't a kaiju movie. I've had it when I was curating the season, so it's really good to have this kind of deep dive into it. The next question, it's actually a translation question, so I'll start with Jeffrey and Stephen chip in if you. I mean, it's quite a quick question, possibly. Is someone saying, talking about it's Mayumi Donovan saying, sorry, I just lost the question. Talking about localization, I prefer saying Godzilla as in the Japanese. Do you know why it was translated as Godzilla? Is there a sort of story behind that you're aware of?
Yeah, I don't know that there's a specific story. It's true that in if you look at older forms of Romanization, sometimes you do see in older texts, like from the early part of the 20th century, the sound G romanized as DZI. That's not without precedent. But I do think that whenever someone sat down in 1954 or 1955, whenever it was, and kind of localized the Japanese version to the American version, the decision to kind of use that older sort of like slightly antiquated Romanization and would allow them to stick the word God into Godzilla. And so that seems in some ways very kind of appropriate. The fact that there is something godlike, there's something deity-like about this huge monster that's just sort of appears out of the ocean every once in a while and tramples across humanity. In fact, the inhabitants of Odo Island, who are first aware of Godzilla, they worship Godzilla as a form of a god. So whoever sat down and did that translation, it's not without precedent. It's not without without reason, but the inclusion of that word God in there, I do think is a small stroke of genius, in that it kind of helps to create that illusion of Godzilla being just enormously overwhelming and powerful.
Thank you. The next question is from David E. Walter, which I shall read out. Godzilla was made on the back of governmental censorship of the atomic bombings. Bombings. How much was lost to the collective consciousness of Japanese society, as the first Godzilla was quite vague over the issue of nuclear weapons and energy, and it was more about post-war survivors than a post-Showa narrative on young people's commentary and attitude towards nuclear war and nuclear energy. Jeffrey, do you want to respond to that?
Sure, that's okay. Yeah, I think that's right on the nose. That indeed, this film is very much about what kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world with nuclear weapons? What are the responsibilities to scientists when they create weapons of mass destruction? Those kind of questions about scientific responsibility are played out very well in the subplot with Dr. Serizawa, the creator of the oxygen destroyer. So the film has these big messages in it. The question about what was lost to the collective consciousness of Japanese society is a little bit hard to answer, because from 1945 to 1952, during the Allied occupation of Japan, there was only two things basically that the Allied powers would censor in writing and in film, and one of them was representations of fraternization between Allied occupying GIs and prostitutes. That was one thing that was not allowed, because it was seen, if we talked about that too much, then it might poison the hearts and minds of the Japanese population against the occupying powers. The second thing to be censored, for exactly the same reasons, were open Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So from 1945 to 1952, it was illegal in Japan to show images of Hiroshima, to show images of Nagasaki. So the population were never able to see them. I think all of us in our minds have horrible images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki burned into our brains. Today is actually the anniversary of the Nagasaki bombing, so it's really appropriate that we're talking about this. But we had these images pre-made in our imagination, but they didn't have those in 1950 up through 1952. So 1952, just a very short time before this film was made in 1954, it was illegal to show images of Hiroshima or Nagasaki in Japan. It wasn't permitted by the censors. So, I mean, in a way, like the kind of visceral knowledge of what an atomic bomb looked like wasn't even available to like the ordinary Japanese population at that time. Do you know what I mean? So, in a way, Godzilla serves as kind of an entry point of like reintroducing, the horrors, or reintroducing, or really introducing the horrors of nuclear war into the consciousness of the larger Japanese population that had probably never seen images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We also should remember too that like when most people were going to the film, to see a film in 1954, they weren't going to see like heavy, deep, heavy, sad images. A lot of people wanted to put the war behind them. They were tired of seeing the burned out ruins in Tokyo, which were still there in 1954. People were tired of that. They wanted to kind of move forward into the future, and Godzilla was a kind of calling upon their memory that that traumatic experiences do come out and sort of reassert themselves from time to time.
Thank you. The next question is from James Mastrokalos, and it's quite a subjective one, which is what, aside from the original Godzilla, what would be considered the best of the genre? And I think I might also add, like, if people who are sort of dipping their toe into the world of kaiju films, what might be a good way to start might also be a way of adding to that answer. So Stephen, go.
Well, I'm not gonna try and be objective about it, because what is objectivity at the end of the day? So I'm going to say what I think are some of the best examples of the genre, and hopefully they are good sort of exploratory entry points as well. So it goes without saying the original Godzilla, but over and above that, in terms of the Godzilla series, Mothra versus Godzilla from 1964, which just screened a couple of nights ago at the Barbican as the inaugural film of all kaiju attack. One of the most highly regarded to this day. 2001's Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All Out Attack by Shusuke Kaneko. Shin Godzilla 2016, absolutely marvelous masterpiece of a film. To my mind, the best Godzilla film other than the original. To my mind, Godzilla -1, of course. And outside of the Godzilla series, Gamera, Guardian of the Universe, 1995, also directed by Shusuke Kaneko, one of the very best kaiju, one of the very best monster films ever made. Oh gosh, what else? I think that's a good couple of films to throw out there. Other Toho films, including like Frankenstein versus Baragon, The War of the Gargantuas, the original Mothra, 1961, is absolutely wonderful, one of Ishiro Honda's best. But I'll leave my recommendations there. Gamera the Brave from 2006 as well. Still to this day, very criminally underseen and undervalued. Wonderful film. I promise that's me done now.
Jeffrey, do you have a similar response?
That's a really good list. I would agree with pretty much all of them. Godzilla -1, I think was such a huge success. I just watched it again, even though of course I know exactly what's going to happen. I still am overwhelmed by the just sheer incredible ability to tell that story so well in such a terse, powerful fashion. I think it's the most frightening Godzilla movie ever made, probably. Maybe even surpassing the original 1954. One other one that I might like to add is Godzilla versus Hedorah, which was from the early 1970s. And this one, it's a very psychedelic, very odd, quirky movie that mixes animation and live action. It's very experimental, and
it's very much a protest film as well.
It's very much a protest film, right? Exactly, about a series of industrial accidents that happened in Japan in the late 1960s, and very, very, very specifically identified in the film. So yeah, it's a really interesting film for a lot of reasons. Quirky.
I mean, I promise I didn't bribe these two gentlemen, but both some of the films they've mentioned are showing as part of All Kaiju Attack. In fact, almost everything's sold out, actually. But we do have some tickets still available for Gamera, Guardian of the Universe, which will be introduced by Stephen Sloss a week on Sunday, but it really is genuinely like the early Gamera films. I think a mixed bag, let's say, but this one really came back with a vengeance. It was released 2 years after Jurassic Park. It's just and there is a little bit of that kind of vibe going on, but it's a really interesting film. And we are also showing Godzilla vs. Hedorah as our outdoor cinema screening. There are still a few tickets available for that, and it's an absolutely crazy film. It's wonderful. It's so inventive, so fun, interesting. There's a lot of psychedelics, a lot of music, a lot of humor. It's wonderful. So do come if you can. Thank you both for mentioning those films. So on to the next question. I will answer. Ask Chris Corker's question. So you've talked about the trauma and audience catharsis, but I was wondering, what you think about the opinions of some scholars, including Bill Tsutsui, that the original Godzilla is actually an optimistic film that attempts to indirectly rewrite the conclusion of the Pacific War. I think there are very similar readings of -1 going on there. Would you describe these movies, even the very first, as optimistic? So that's an interesting one. Stephen, do you want to go?
I think I just wanted to say quickly, I think we've had a note that this has to be the last question. But I think it's an important thing to say that in terms of like, attempts at rewriting history, we have to be very diligent with this sort of thing, because films like Godzilla -1 and Shin Godzilla, and sometimes even the original Godzilla, have had accusations of Japanese nationalism against them, broadly from critics and audiences in the West, much like us here. And there seems to be from my perspective, there's a semi-recurring issue in Western critics and audiences regarding some of these films, that they cannot seem to accept a Japan that will not bow down to its own destruction, will not accept its own annihilation. We see this in Shin Godzilla, we see it in Godzilla -1. So I think when we're talking about this sort of thing of rewriting history, it's we have to be very, very careful, and also bear in mind that we are English speakers in the West. First and foremost, these films are not for us. We're interpreting them and viewing them from an entirely different cultural background and perspective. We don't have the immediacy of being a Japanese audience, but I digress. I'm not sure I would classify the original Godzilla as particularly an optimistic film. I think it has optimistic scenes. It has optimistic elements to it. I think it's more of a warning film. This is a very, very recent, and to be honest, it's a very, very basic comparison, but it's also think about the ending of Oppenheimer, where Oppenheimer says that we might not have destroyed the world with the nuclear weapons, but we now have the ability to. And isn't that the same? There's a lot of echoes of that in Dr. Yamane's last lines in Godzilla. So I don't think it's strictly an optimistic film. I think it's a warning film. Godzilla -1, I would argue, is an optimistic film. Godzilla -1 is all about, to me, the indomitable nature of the human spirit, how there is always something to live for, to fight for, no matter what you've been through in your past, no matter what you feel that you've done or said or who you've hurt. There's always something to live for and pull together, whether that's through interpersonal relationships, whether that's through community in the face of tragedy, in the face of annihilation, even. Godzilla -1, even though it does, spoiler alert, end on a hint of Godzilla's survival, I think it's a very optimistic film.
Jeffrey, do you want to add to that?
I'm trying to think about how I should compress all of my many thoughts about this subject into a quick soundbite answer. I agree with pretty much everything that Stephen just mentioned. The only thing I might add is that there is definitely I would agree overall that the film is not optimistic about the state of nuclear weapons in the world. In fact, the very last, sentence of the film is, if we're not careful, then something like this might happen again. Another Godzilla might arise quickly. So there's, it ends with a warning. So we can't say that it's all optimistic, but there is this other interesting aspect of that story where, the problem of radiation that's represented by Godzilla is solved through yet another technological means, the oxygen destroyer. So there is a way in which the story itself suggests that when you have technological problems, then more technology might be the answer to them. And so there is a kind of certain type of technological optimism that that is, latent in that text, and some critics have kind of read this in relationship to the Japanese society that emerged after Godzilla came out, and then especially in the 1960s and 70s, where Japan was, has been attempting to solve so many of its different economic problems, its different social problems. Even now, it's issue of large numbers of elderly people with robots and things like that. So there's a kind of technological optimism that is implied there. How far we can carry that forward is perhaps a matter of debate. Godzilla -1, I could say so much about this, but I think I'll just stop here and and save that for another time.
Thank you. Time cruelly has got the better of us, so I don't have enough time for any more questions, but I'll end with one comment, which is from Tomoko Nagano, saying, before this fantastic talk is over, I want to express my appreciation for the Western Michigan University representation here. Go Broncos. I'm going to guess that's aimed at Jeffrey. So, so yes, well, thank you very much. That was a really, really interesting talk. I'm so sorry we couldn't get through more questions. It's been a really interesting discussion. All Kaiju Attack runs at the Barbican throughout August. Tickets, as has been said, still available for 2 of the screenings, Gamera, Guardian of the Universe, and Godzilla vs. Hedorah. And Stephen will be on stage at the Barbican a week on Sunday. And Jeffrey's translations of Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again are now available online. So I will hand back to Junko.
Thank you very much for such an animated and enthusiastic talk I ever organized in the past. I thoroughly enjoyed it because Godzilla is not something my cup of tea, but as I said to all of you before this meeting, that's a webinar, I enjoyed that Mothra versus Godzilla. And then I was really, really impressed by that special effect when there was no CG, of course, nonetheless. And also the iconic music, I enjoyed that iconic music there. As actually Alex said, that there will be more screening coming up on that Barbican, but tickets are very scarce. So that if you can grab it, please do so. And also that Jeffrey's translated fabulous book, Godzilla and then Godzilla Raids Again. One thing I would actually tell about this book is that, of course, novellas are very interesting, but I learned quite a lot from that afterwards that Jeffrey wrote. And it's actually worth buying because, even for that afterwards. And it's really informative. And then it shows that Jeffrey is knowledgeable about that Godzilla itself. But otherwise, thank you so much for all of you, Alex, and then Stephen, and then Jeffrey. I don't know how to stop. I didn't know how to stop it. So I'm sure that everybody enjoyed that this online talk. And I hope you continue to love Godzilla and the Monsters film. Thank you so much for this Friday evening. Thank you so much, and have a nice evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.